Welcome to the poetry of reality. I don't have a religion, but I think if I had one, it would be the religion of reality. And it's a pleasure to meet Helen Joyce here, as I haven't met her before. I wanted to meet her ever since reading her wonderful book, Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. Science is all about reality, and science and reality have come up against some competition, some opposition, and Helen has been in the forefront of fighting against some of this opposition. There's a character in a Kingsley Amis novel, I think, who gets interviewed on television, and the interviewer tells him who he is and what he does and how long he's done it. And so that's a typical trope of television, to tell the interviewee about herself. But I'm going to ask Helen to introduce herself very briefly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. Well, I work for an advocacy organisation called Sex Matters now, but my background has been rather varied. So when I was a little girl, I wanted to be a dancer, and I actually went off to dance school when I left school at 16. And after 2 years, realised that wasn't a great idea and went and did a degree in maths in Trinity College Dublin. And I stayed and did my master's in Cambridge and my PhD in maths at UCL in London, and then spent 3 years doing postdoc in mathematics before changing course and going into public understanding of maths and science. And then in 2005, I joined The Economist as the education correspondent. And I spent 17 years there doing various jobs, along the way living in Brazil as a foreign correspondent, and then becoming an editor of various sections of the paper, including the international and finance sections. And one fateful day in 2017, the editor sat down beside me at lunch and said, "Why do the kids keep coming home and saying such and such is trans?" And I said, "I have no idea. Shall I look into it for you?" And my first attempt to find an author, I found somebody who had been through a lot of queer theory and gender studies at university and managed to write 3 pages about people identifying as male or female, man or woman, without ever mentioning that sex is about reproduction and that the sexes are reproductive roles and that they're evolved categories. And I had to bin that piece, and I ended up writing it myself. And by this time I realised that there was a lot of very odd stuff happening here. And that turned into my book, which came out in 2021.
It is a very odd phenomenon because I'm used to continua wherever I look. I mean, there's tall versus short, fat versus thin, old versus young. All these things are a smooth continuum. The one thing that isn't is sex. I mean, sex really is binary. There's no question about it. You're either male or female, and it's absolutely clear. You can do it on gamete size. You can do it on chromosomes. And so it is, to me, as a biologist, distinctly weird that people can simply declare, "I am a woman, though I have a penis." That seems to me to be a strange distortion of language, because language is useful as something to express your thoughts clearly. And so I'm bewildered by it, and I was fascinated to read your book, and I learned a tremendous lot from it. While I'm about it, I could recommend a couple of other books. Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, about particularly focusing on young girls and how they get misled. And this one, Material Girls by Kathleen Stock. I listened to this on audio, so I don't have a physical copy of the book, so I printed out the cover of it. Helen, what do you think lies behind this odd distortion of reality?
So that was basically the question that got me into this in the first place. And I mean, I've been thinking really almost full time about this for about 5 years now, and I don't have a pat answer for you. I think, like a lot of interesting phenomena, it's a lot of things. I would say that when I started to write about it first, I quickly realised that this wasn't treated the same way as anything else, like just asking very obvious questions. Like, don't you think that if we allow people to self-identify their sex, this will lead to, for example, destroying women's sports or putting rapists in women's jails? People would turn this back on me and say, you think that trans people are predators, or you think that trans people are in bad faith, you're a bigot. And I hadn't experienced this before in, at that point, about 14 years as a journalist.
That's a willful misunderstanding.
Yes, it is. It is willful misunderstanding. And I mean, I slowly became aware that what we were talking about here was an intensely linguistic movement. Like, there isn't a sense in which a man can become a woman except linguistically. Like, yes, okay, he can have operations, and some people do. Most trans people don't have any operations, don't take any medicine, don't have any genital surgery. But that doesn't change your sex. I mean, the reason the female eunuch is called that is that Germaine Greer was pointing at the way that the man is seen as the full human and the woman is seen as the lacking human. She is a female eunuch. She's a man that you've castrated. But actually, female people aren't male people lacking something, or male people lacking something with a little grow bag that you pop a baby out of every now and then. Female people are their own category. Female and male are actually very profound categories. They're profound biological, evolved categories.
Well, evolutionarily, they have to be. The gift of giving birth is something that pervades the whole anatomy and physiology and psychology, actually.
Exactly. And if you're a mammal, every part of your body is female. Like, earthworms have both parts,
Yes.
But, my hands are female, my jaw is female. Mm. It's not just that I have, I'm a man with a uterus popped in and no penis. But so it was the only sense in which a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man is by saying so. It's a speech utterance. And so I've come to see, I think there are many things happening here. There's things happening in medicine, in politics. But one of the things that's happening is a long run, maybe 2 or 3 century move towards seeing categories and classification as inherently oppressive. So people think, heteronormative is a bad thing. Or they think that, the traditional family is constraining. And they miss the point that these things often, like when I say evolved, I don't mean like evolutionary biology. I mean that they came to be over significant amounts of time for a reason, and they're supportive as well as constraining. But everything that's structured or categorized or named or classified, that's now seen as something imposed upon people. So somebody like Judith Butler, for example, who's the queer theorist who wrote Gender Trouble, which is kind of the foundational text that academia uses when looking at these issues, says that gender is an imitation for which there is no original. That she doesn't see sex. She says sex is socially constructed and gender is the real thing. And there isn't any foundation for gender. It's just something that's made meaningful by performing it over and over again. Now, I hadn't come across this at university. As I say, I studied mathematics. And I spent my time proving theorems and defining my terms very carefully. So I was blissfully ignorant of the fact that significant numbers of young people are being taught this sort of nonsense. But they come out of it thinking that somebody who says, look, there are 2 sexes and the sex that you are is the sex that you were conceived as, they think that what you're doing is imposing social roles on them. So I was brought up to think that what was liberatory and what was progressive was to say, well, this little person is a girl. Let's not let her stop. Let's not let that stop her doing anything. She could be an astronaut. She could be president.
Quite. I mean, I think we were all sort of, when I was brought up to think that you could do whatever you wanted to. You have the power to, as you said, be an astronaut, be whatever you damn well like. And it's as though this trend now is reverting to stereotyped girls like pink and boys like blue and boys like playing with Meccano sets and girls like playing with dolls. And it's a stereotyping which I kind of revolt against, and yet it seems to be increasingly fashionable.
Absolutely, and it's worse than just the old-fashioned stereotyping that would have said, look, this child is definitely a boy, and if he doesn't like rugby and so on, well, he's a pufter, and let's bully him. It's now saying he's actually a girl.
Yes.
So, there's the pink and the blue boxes have been structured and remade and reinforced, and a child who doesn't fit into the one that's for the sex that they were, inverted commas, assigned at birth, we have to pop them into the other one. And if you call them out on this, they say, no, that's gender expression, that's gender roles you're talking about. We're talking about gender identity, which is a sort of a posited, innate knowing that you pop into the world with. But nobody pops into the world knowing that sort of thing about themselves. Children learn it from the stereotypes. They self-examine and match themselves against the stereotypes. So now we say to little, what you used to call a sissy boy, that little boy now thinks that he's meant to be a girl. And teachers may say that's not what I'm telling him, but it is what they're telling him.
Yes, I was very upset to see evidence from your book and others that teachers and doctors perhaps are latching on to a child who expresses the slightest doubt about this and then it affirms them as being the opposite gender to their sex.
I mean, it's worse than that they latch onto it. They suggest sell it.
Yes.
You know, these books for 2 and 3 and 5-year-olds that say you must examine your gender.
I've got here a quote from a girl from America. I think she must have been about 12 when this happened to her. She says, I was in a very liberal school. And she says, there was so much peer pressure to either be gay or trans at this school. Basically, it felt like you weren't cool if you were heterosexual. This made me even question myself quite a few times, even though I'm heterosexual. I know that this pressure can be real for so many children. Some of them may actually be gay or trans, and I will definitely support them and fight for them in the end. But that's pretty young to be labelling herself in any permanent way, in my opinion. She was a very bright girl. She's actually written books about science for children, and very, very impressive. And I was really depressed to read her letter that there is peer pressure and even teacher pressure to really go against reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And teachers think that they're being progressive, you know. So in this country, we don't have a syllabus for sex ed, for relationships and sex ed. There's some sort of very vague things that you're meant to cover, like the facts about sex and gender identity, or the facts about sexual orientation and gender identity, without telling you what those facts are. I don't think there are any facts about gender identity. And so there are these external providers who are basically lobby groups that write unbelievably inaccurate materials and then sell them to schools. So I've seen short videos and they're so nicely made. There's one by a guy who calls himself Ollie, and his sidekick is a balloon, and they call themselves Pop and Ollie. And Pop and Ollie, you know, it's very bright and colourful. And they're like, your sex is the best guess that a doctor had when you were born. They looked at you and guessed. We're just guessed. We're waiting for you.
Wait a minute.
They guess your sex.
You had a penis and yet they guessed.
Yes. Yeah. They often,
a doctor.
Yeah. They often conflate this fact that there are people who have differences or disorders of sex development, which is a tiny number of people. I mean, a few people do need investigations.
0.02%.
Exactly. And even then, you know, mostly they're getting investigated for conditions that don't cast doubt on their sex. It's just their genitals have not developed normally. Yeah. So, I mean, probably about 6 people a year in this country, in Britain, have their sex assigned at birth. The rest of us, the doctor writes it down. Anyway, so it says, you know, so the doctor guesses your sex, and then when you're old enough, you get the chance to tell everybody what sex you are. Are you male, female, a boy or a girl, or something else in between? And then stars come behind him, and it looks like you're going through the galaxy, and it says, or something else entirely. And we get off this putative sex spectrum down here. What are you meant to make of this if you're 8? Like, right. First off, that you're very boring if you think that you're a boy or a girl. But also, you're just given no hints as to what this gender thing is. So you look around and you see Barbie and G.I. Joe and, you know, that sort of thing. And you say, well, I don't like Barbie. I might be a boy. It's incredibly regressive.
Yes. Somewhere in your book, there's a story about a mother who had 8 children. And she said, and not a single one of them is boring cis. Is that what she said?
That's right.
Yes.
So cis is this very new coinage that's by analogy with trans.
Yes.
Because what they don't want is you saying, you know, real women and trans women, or normal women and trans women, or actual women and trans women. They want there to be 2 types of women. So they need a symmetric word to trans, and that is cis.
Cis, yeah.
On the same side of.
Yes.
And so this woman, I found this quote in a closed Facebook group in America for parents of trans kids. Somebody gave me a password into it, and I lurked there for a while and watched. And there were doctors, gender doctors in there, selling treatments, answering questions with extremely inaccurate information, like claiming that science has settled on things that it's not. But mostly what you saw was the parents reinforcing each other's false beliefs. So a new parent will come in and go, hi, you know, my great little trans boy, which is a girl, you know, she's 4. I'm learning so much from her. Sorry, I've forgotten which way around I'm having this child. Let's say it's really a girl and this girl says she's a boy. You know, my little trans guy, I'm learning so much from him, but I'm just wondering, like, I'm a bit worried about socially transitioning him in case I'm leading him on the path to medicalisation. And then people will love bomb her and come in and say, wow, great to have you here with us.
Love bomb, that is what religious cults do. They love bomb is the phrase they actually use, I think.
Yes, that's right. And then if you step out of line, if at any point you say, well, I'm not going to do
Then
whatever
you're
this
a
thing
heretic.
is,
Then you're
and you are just going to get piled on
apostate.
and you'll get kicked out.
Yeah.
And the thing that these people use more than anything else is the emotional blackmail of telling you that if you don't get with the program, your child will kill themselves.
Now that is appalling because well, put it another way, the evidence for that had better be damn good. Otherwise, it is the most appalling blackmail. How good is the evidence? I mean, the evidence that it does lead to suicide.
It doesn't. So the important thing to understand is that the reason they say suicide, it's not just that it's emotional blackmail, it's that they're suggesting that you put your child on a pathway that leads to sterility. Because if you put a child on puberty blockers early in puberty and then you put them on cross-sex hormones, at some point, we don't know exactly when, but maybe at 20 or 21, you've missed your opportunity. Your own sex organs are not going to grow. You are not going to be a person who can conceive or impregnate somebody else. So they're sterilising children, and the only reason you would ever do that is to save a child's life.
So it has to be...
Yeah, it has to be death. It has to be death or sterility.
Yes.
So that's why suicide. Now, there are not a lot of children committing suicide, thankfully. It's very, very rare in minors to commit suicide. So that's the first bit of evidence that this is not true. There's an enormous boom in trans identification. There has been no concomitant boom in suicide, again, thankfully. But there have actually been a few papers that have looked at children who are on the waiting list for gender clinics. And what they have found is that these children, they do have a lot of mental comorbidities, mental health comorbidities. So you are seeing higher rates of depression, anxiety, eating disorders.
That's there anyway, and they're depressed anyway, or bulimic, or something like that.
They say that, of course, that it's the stress, the minority stress that's causing these things, but there's no evidence that that's true. It's at least as probable, and I would say much more probable, that a child who's looking for solutions to feeling miserable and is sold that if you're trans, you can reinvent yourself, you're like a phoenix, you'll rise from the ashes a new person, all your problems will be left behind. So yes, so the suicide rate is, and the self-harm rate is a little higher than it is in the general population, but not out of line for mental health conditions.
Yeah.
And important to say, there is literally no evidence that transitioning the child will decrease that risk.
Yes, so it does seem like terrible emotional blackmail. People like you who are standing up about this, and mostly women, I suppose, are getting an awful lot of persecution. I think you're very brave, and J.K. Rowling's very brave, Kathleen Stock's very brave, Maya Forstater is very brave. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, it is.
Yes. What gives you the courage?
I mean, I don't want to answer for anybody else, although I work with Maya daily, so I sort of see where she comes from in it. And I know Kathleen, and I've met Jo Rowling. It's my privilege to have met her. In my case, I was lucky to work somewhere that has a very collegiate and rigorously intellectual atmosphere, namely The Economist. But even there, of course, there were people who didn't agree that I should be speaking about this, and it was awkward on occasion. I would say in my case, I was in too deep. I was so far steeped in blood that there was no way back. Before I knew that this was going to be a problem, I was so far in that I couldn't get back. And then I was quite negative about it. I really felt that something very bad was happening. And, all the people who think that something very bad is happening, they'll pick a different bit of it. They'll say it's about free speech, or it's about women's rights, or it's about children's health, or it's about just, basic reality or sanity. And it was all of those things for me. But then I went to an event at which some detransitioners were speaking, and this would have been, I think, late 2019. And I found it a profoundly upsetting event. So at this one in particular, there were 6 young women. Of course, there are boys who transition and detransition too, but this was 6 young women, all of whom had thought they were boys. And they were all of them lesbians who had been misled by their early gender nonconformity into thinking they must be boys. And they had gone various stages down the medical pathway. And one of them, who was 23, was this very articulate young woman who had suffered from anorexia in her teens, and at 18 had stumbled upon the idea that she was trying to starve away her curves because she was meant to be a boy. And by 21, she had all her sex organs removed and was on testosterone. She had no breasts, no uterus, no ovaries. She had a beard, her hair was receding. And by 23, when she still wasn't feeling any better, and she still had an eating disorder, she one day had the thought, how can an operation, namely a hysterectomy, that only a woman can have, turn me into a man? And that bounced her all the way back to I am a woman, that is just a fact about me. And so I sat there and I listened to these young women. And, you know, I have a very soft spot for gay kids. I have a gay son myself. He's never had gender dysphoria. It's important to say that. He's never had any theory that he's a girl or anything like that. But I have a soft spot for these kids because they're quite non-conforming. And, you know, finding your way as a teenager is difficult anyway. But for these kids, it's a little bit more difficult because as they're growing up, they're also realising they're different.
I mean, how many of these children do you think are just simply gay anyway?
Well, I mean, according to the Tavistock Clinic, which is the UK's main gender identity clinic for children, the great majority of the children they see are same-sex attracted. There's a strong statistical
So they could have
link.
been perfectly happy growing up as...
Yes, so we are turning potentially healthy gay adults into sterile, straight simulacra of the opposite sex.
One of the points you make, I think, is that there are certain parents who would rather have a trans child than a gay child. And
Yes.
Is that part of the motivation?
Yeah, and I don't think it's always stated up front. And, you know, some people think that that's very implausible. But I think that they don't realise the dynamic in some families and in some cultures, as in, you know, local cultures in school or whatever. It's really hard to be gender non-conforming, like right bone deep gender non-conforming. I don't mean someone like me who's a fairly normal woman but did a PhD in maths. I mean somebody that everything about your style and your taste and the way you move and your interests just really screams, you know, camp for your boy or butch if you're a girl. And you have to be let a lot of freedom to be yourself, and not a lot, you know, nothing has to be made of this by the grown-ups around you. And if things start to be made about it, you start to question yourself and think, like, why am I so different? Like, why am I a boy who only likes the girls? And why am I a girl who only likes the boys? What's wrong with me? And then the thought comes up in your own mind, was I meant to be a girl? Was I meant to be a boy? Like, we knew this already in about 2000. The research had been done. The papers had been examined. We know that the gender nonconformity comes first in these kids, and the gender dysphoria, the distress, is a result of the gender nonconformity and the meaning that is made of that. So if no meaning is made of it, you just grow up. And you might be an unusual straight person, but you're quite likely to be gay. But if a lot of meaning is made out of it, you interpret that as being that there's a woman inside or there's a man inside. And then the people around you may think that too. And your parents may find this very hard. Like a man who's always wanted a boy to take to the football and, you know, he can, with the best will in the world, he may fail to not seem disappointed.
Yeah.
And the same with a mother who wanted a daughter who went to ballet and to go shopping with and so on, and she gets some little rough and tumble character who just wants tree climbing and rugby. You get the impression that you're a big disappointment to your parents. And this dynamic can unfold between them both. And what you need is family therapy, really, from someone supportive to point this out to you and to guide you gently through. And instead, you end up in a gender clinic and they say, oh, your child's gender identity. Oh, you have a little trans boy, you have a little trans girl.
Yeah. Whereas in the past, you've just said, well, she's a tomboy and you know.
Well, with a girl, you would have.
Yes.
Poor old boys. The boys, they tried to straighten them out.
Yes. Yes.
Horrible.
Yes.
But the girls was much easier.
Easier
You just
for
let them
girls.
out, tell them
Yes.
to climb some trees and you know, look back
Yes.
when they're 16.
Yes. I'm perfectly happy to address a trans person by their preferred name and preferred pronouns. I think it's just a matter of politeness, really. What I object to is the insistence that I am a woman. I mean, you're not a woman. I'm perfectly prepared to call you she if you like, and to call you whatever your preferred name is. But to say I am a woman is a debauching of language, and that's where I draw the line.
I've become much more hardline on this, and I would like not to be. I would have started where you are. But what I've learned is that somebody who expects to be called she also expects the words woman and female, and mother,
Yes.
and sister, and daughter. And it's very hard, if you give away sexed language, to explain why this person cannot in all circumstances be treated as a woman. So often people do this preamble. It happens to me less now, but 2 years ago when my book came out, it happened a lot. They would give a preamble to any interview with me in which they said, you know, of course, neither of us is transphobic and we're very happy to use people's names and pronouns and treat you as a woman or treat you as a man. And I started to think, like, what do you mean by treat somebody as a man or a woman? Because we've got rid of all the unjust and unjustifiable differences between the sexes and the way we treat people now.
Yeah.
We've equalised pension age. You know, my mother had to leave her job when she got married in the Irish civil service because there was a ban on married women. We've got rid of all that stuff. And now treating somebody as a woman means either I just notice that they're a woman in a space like any other space where it just doesn't actually matter what sex people are, or it means we're in a single sex space and they shouldn't be there.
We'll come on to that in a moment.
But if you want to try and explain why, you have to use sex-based language. So I have to say the reason this person cannot come in here is because he is a man.
Yes.
And if I say she, I'm already selling the farm.
Yes. Do you make a distinction between people who've gone through the ordeal of surgery and being castrated or whatever and having their breasts removed or whatever, and people who just simply stand up and say, I am a woman or I am a man? It does seem to me that there's almost a sense you sort of paid your dues if you've subjected yourself to. I mean, you're really serious about it. You're really earnest about it. You're not just frivolously standing up and saying, I've decided I'm a woman today, sort of thing.
I don't make any distinction because I don't think that being a woman or a man is the sort of thing that you pay a price to be.
Yes.
It's just a very base fact about
okay.
you. But more than that, in a space where a man is not supposed to be, I don't know whether he's been castrated or not. I'm telling from his secondary sex features, and they don't change if he's been through the surgery. But the other reason is that in international human rights law, there can't be any distinction on the basis of whether the person has been castrated, because it's a basic principle that's been adjudicated on now in several courts, is that you can't make something conditional on getting yourself sterilised, because it's human rights abuse to do that. So if you say to people, you've paid your dues if you cut the bits off, and that'll give you, the reward is that we'll now treat you as a woman or we'll treat you as a man, you are inducing people to go through a really horrific surgery and to give up something.
Yeah.
So that cannot be a legal line.
No.
And then the last thing I'd say is, like, they've paid their dues to whom? Like,
well, no,
I know, like, to the other people around them, you know?
Yes.
If you come into a women's space, who have you paid your dues to?
Paid dues is the wrong phrase, but
no, I've heard it before.
You've shown you're serious about it. You've shown that you're. I mean, somebody who let's talk about sports for a moment. Somebody who's a moderately good swimmer as a man, but kind of mediocre, and then suddenly just says, "I am a woman."
Yes.
And because he says I'm a woman, he's then allowed to go and break all the records of female swimming. That seems to me to be unserious. You're just saying you're a woman because you want to say you're a woman. Whereas if you've been through the surgery,
but he's still not a woman.
But there's a sort of feeling that he really means it. He's sincere about it.
I mean, I could say I was sincere about being astronaut. It doesn't make me an astronaut. And the surgery doesn't make any difference to your sporting performance. So if we're protecting what it is to be female in a sports category, which we are, that's how sports categories work. You know, we protect under 18s, over 35s, Paralympians, flyweights.
Yeah.
The thing that we're protecting is femaleness. And the fact that a man is very, very serious in wishing to be seen as female doesn't move his category.
No, that's true. But, okay, let's take the example of the astronaut that you just mentioned. Just say, I'm an astronaut, and you're obviously not. But if, on the other hand, you've gone through the rigorous training of an astronaut and you've put yourself through all the it's really rather a hard graft to become an astronaut. You've proved you're serious about it.
But I've also become an astronaut. So that's the thing.
You might be not good enough to become an astronaut, but you've tried.
Then I would not be an astronaut.
No, you wouldn't be an astronaut, but you've tried.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that male and female are prizes for effort. They're just observations of categories that we are.
Yes, yeah, okay.
I mean, it keeps the numbers down, there's that.
Yes.
But, for a long time, we didn't see men who identified as trans in women's sports because they did set a surgery rule. And at the time, the surgery was really only done on people in their 40s and older.
Yes.
So you didn't see any prime-aged men. And now that it's just a testosterone level is all that many of the sporting bodies require, that you lower your testosterone. And I mean, honestly, they can't check that. It's just a paper rule. It's not a real one. Younger men can identify as women. And so now we're actually seeing men who are, pretty good athletes and who are then world record breakers as women.
Yes.
But it's all wrong. Like, if we're protecting the female category, then no male advantage belongs
Yes,
in it.
if
It's that simple.
if we're going to have separate female athletic competitions at all, then
Yeah. And if we don't, then there will be no women who win anything.
yes. I mean, you could say everything's open. You're just a human, and you go in for everything, and then, as you say, women wouldn't win
Anything.
Yes, maybe gymnastics.
But gymnastics is an interesting example because male and female gymnastics are very different. Like, the one thing that women really have an advantage in is flexibility.
Yes.
But male gymnastics, yes, they're flexible, but mostly they're strong. So they do very different things. They just do different events for the men and women. Neither sex would be any good in the others in gymnastics.
Yes. Okay. There's a lot in your book about changing rooms, so we better talk about that. Tell us a bit about that.
I think another thing that people often give away when they start to think about this is they think, well, I understand that you need female-only spaces if they're, say, rape crisis centres or, really specialist services. But they think, like, oh, what about public toilets and maybe even changing rooms, like have cubicles? And they miss the point that these are sort of mass arrangements for the convenience of the half of humanity that experiences rape at the hands of the other half of humanity, that experiences the two most common sex crimes, which are voyeurism and exhibitionism, and they're an inclusion measure for women. So the first female public toilets were brought in so that women didn't experience what was called the urinary leash, which meant that women had to stay near the home because they needed to be able to go. And, women have to take off clothing from the bottom half of them to go to the toilet. Men don't. You're quite vulnerable when you're weeing. And so women in the Victorian era, would have to always be able to be aware that there was somewhere they could go to wee, otherwise they could get assaulted. And it was the factory girls, actually, who campaigned for the first public toilets, because they were getting sexually assaulted if they tried to wee during a factory day. They weren't able to work outside the home. And then you think, like, all the special situations that women need, just ordinary spaces like toilets and changing rooms for. Like, women menstruate. As I said, women take off more of their clothes to go to the toilet. We take much longer. Young girls in particular, like little girls, are at risk. Like, if you're a man who's out with your daughter who's 6, 7, 8, 9, and you want to send her to the toilet, you want to be able to pop her into the women's loos and know that there's only women in there, because she's really at risk, actually, if it's a mixed sex space. Then there's Muslim women. And there's women who have been raped, who are survivors of sexual assault and who can have really serious flashbacks in enclosed spaces if there are males there with them. And now we're losing all of these spaces. They're either going gender neutral or they're going self-ID. Like, they'll put a sign up saying, use whichever space you feel most comfortable in. And about a year ago at Sex Matters, where I work with Maya Forstater now, we put out a call for evidence as to why people cared about single-sex spaces. And we did hear stories about specialist spaces like rape crisis centres, but mostly we heard about toilets and changing rooms. And this phrase got said over and over again. People wrote us almost essays about it. They said, I went along to my local swimming pool, and there's a bloke who calls himself a woman who's now using the changing room. And I've never told anybody. I'm in my 50s now, but I was raped when I was 14 and I never told anybody. And I found myself in this enclosed space and I looked around and there was this bloke and I froze and I remembered everything terrible that had happened to me and I left and I never went back. So women are being pushed out of public spaces again by the loss of these spaces that were introduced in order that we could play a full part in public life.
You were telling me before we started, which I didn't know, that competitive swimmers, Olympic-type swimmers, have to wriggle into their streamlined swimsuits, and so they don't just sort of quickly put it on the way the rest of us do. How long does it take?
Like, it can take up to 40 minutes. So I didn't know this when I wrote the book, or I would have put it in. So at the time I was writing the book, there were a few athletes who were making it into elite women's sport who were men. So Laurel Hubbard was the big example at the time, who's a weightlifter, a New Zealand weightlifter, a man in his 40s. But in between the hardback and the paperback, along came Leah or Will Thomas, who's a young man who's 6'4", who's about 21, 22, and who started swimming in American college races. And I mean, it's bad enough when you look, like you see people in their swimsuits, you can see who's a man and who's a woman, and he's really towering over the women. And he doesn't have good technique. You know, he's just using his shoulder strength and not even kicking his legs, and he still wins. And then I heard one of the young women who had to compete against him describing what it is like doing competitive swimming. So they wear these streamlined suits, and they're compression suits that like just make you very cut through the water fast, and it's very, very hard to get on, and the compression doesn't last all that long, so you change suit every time you race, and you also don't wear that suit when you're doing your warm-up. And there's dozens of events, you know, all the different lengths and strokes, and there's maybe many competitors in all of them. They have these big open changing rooms, and you're running in, you strip completely naked, you put on your practice suit, you go out, you do your warm-up, you come back in, you strip completely naked again, and then you start this miserable business of shimmying into your race suit, which is incredibly tight, and you have to sort of wriggle and bounce and wriggle and bounce and get it up over your hips and then wriggle and bounce yourself in completely naked through all of this, and all around you everyone else is doing the same thing. And there's this 6'4" bloke, and in case anyone wants to know, no, he has not had surgery, and no, there are not cubicles, and no, you cannot hold a towel in your way. And that's what you're doing. And these poor girls, like the girls on his own team at the university that he's at, but all the women who had to compete against him, if they complained, they were told that they were bigots. Riley Gaines, who's the one of them who's spoken out the most, was warned by her university that if she kept talking about it, she would not be taken on to medical school.
Told she's a bigot by somebody senior in the university?
Yeah, by the sports team, by the EDI team in the university, EDI meaning Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, told that they'll be referred for counselling, the women of the university, where Leah Thomas is, I think it's University of Pennsylvania. The girls on his own team, because they complained anonymously, and they finally found someone to send their complaints. And they were told they would be referred for counselling to learn to cope with their transphobia, to cope with losing, basically.
I'm baffled by why this is also one-sided. I realise there are two different points of view here, but how has one side managed to kind of capture the dominant dialogue, really, the dominant half of the dialogue, and constantly it comes up that if you dissent from that, you're called a bigot, and so people don't want to dissent because dissent, and so I don't want to call it cowardice, but it's pardonable cowardice because nobody wants to be called a bigot. But why does all the abuse go one way? Why is it such a Why does all the bullying go one way?
I mean, there are so many different answers to that. And, I think they all reinforce each other. And one of them is because this is a linguistic movement and there is no sense in which Leah Thomas is a woman except that you say he is, you must silence people. It's the only way in which you can keep the fiction going. If people can say what they see in front of them.
Only way in which he can keep the fiction going. But why does he have these abettors and accomplices who
I mean, you can't ignore the fact that this is for the benefit of men. You know, like female sports has always been fifth rate. Like it gets much less funding. You know, these girls they're told things that nobody would tell a male athlete, like that, you know, it's for the joy of taking part. Yeah. Why do you care about winning? I think in America, it's become so associated with the very, very polarized political system. So, you know, and everyone tends to take their political opinions as a package. That's not an American fault solely. But in America, it's so polarized that they're really very specific packages. And if you want not to take the opinion that gender identity trumps sex, then you're a Republican, you have to be a conservative Christian, you have to be anti-abortion, you have to think that women belong in the kitchen, you know. And so if you don't want those things, well, you've got to come over here and give up women's sports and say that men can be women and say that, you know, there can be a female penis and so on. And then, I mean, there's a sort of an evolutionary point to make here. Like sometimes when you look at a giraffe or a platypus or something and you say, how did this come to be? You could answer that by sort of going back, and I think you did this in your beautiful book. Which one was it? The one where you go back in the Tree of Life backwards, quite thick one.
Oh, The Ancestor's Tale. That's
lovely, yes, that book. So you can go back and you can actually answer that question, or you can just say, look, that's how evolution works. Yeah. You know, so we have this is an emerging ideology, some would say neo-religion, And out of the many, many bizarre things that people could believe, this is the one that made it. And you could then point at, the internet, the arrival of sex change surgery, the fact that we're all online too much, social media places where kids congregate without adults and talk to each other without adult oversight, the cowardice of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, which is a dreadfully corrupt organisation. I mean, it allowed the cheating by the East German women dopers to go on in full sight for 20 years and has never sorted that out and never taken the medals away from them. They just don't care. The show keeps on the road as far as they're concerned. So there's just all these different things that happened, and the result is what we see, as opposed to me being able to say, I would have been able to predict this in advance. I'd never predicted the platypus either.
Yes, the platypus wasn't believed when it was first sent to the museum.
Well, exactly. So this is a platypus in a way.
Yes. Is there a tension between the LGBT?
Yes.
Is the T a little bit more? I mean, is there some opposition between the LGB on the one hand and the T on the other?
I mean, depends who you ask and depends what you think these are. If you think these are identities, and especially if you think in American identities. So in the American way of thinking, there is the white supremacist, the cis-het white male who runs the world and everybody else is oppressed by that person. And the more ways in which you're oppressed, kind of the better in this culture. Then LGBTQIA++, all of those things are, you're not cis-het.
Yes.
Meaning cis and heterosexual. On the other hand, if you actually just think that LGB is a shorthand for people who aren't heterosexual, like people who are either homosexual or bisexual, and you understand those as people who have unusual sexualities, which, has been until very recently a major reason that people have been oppressed, like as in sent to jail, given electric shocks, cast out by their families, like really bad things, then what the hell is T doing in there?
Yes.
Like T is an identity, it's not a sexuality. And more than that, T is an identity that undermines the very basis of sexuality. Because if you're trans, you move category, or in your mind you move category, from male to female, and that means you change sexuality as well. So a straight man becomes a lesbian.
Yes.
And that's not very much what most lesbians find very helpful for their...
No, I mean, there is tension. Lesbians do feel threatened, I think, don't they?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it works both ways, like a lot of things to do with sex. Formally it works both ways. Like a woman who identifies as a man, like a straight woman who identifies as a man, becomes a gay man. And this is increasingly popular among teenage girls, to identify as gay men. I think they're not going to have much success when they get older. It's not going to go very well because that's not how gay culture works. But the other way round, you've got men who are bigger, stronger, more sexually aggressive. Lesbians are the people who've always found it hardest to keep their footing in the alphabet soup. Like, I have a lot of lesbian friends now doing this work, and they'll tell you that the LGB groupings never paid attention to their needs. They paid attention to gay men's needs. And so now a lesbian-only group will usually find itself under pressure to admit heterosexual men who think of themselves as lesbians. And then when you add to that the fact that there's a very common male sexual interest, a fetish, in cross-dressing, and that there are significant numbers of men who find it very sexy to think of themselves as lesbians, probably as many of those as there are actual lesbians. You're like, well, these people come into your spaces and now it's not a lesbian space anymore.
Yeah. Yes. One thing that really pisses me off, it came up a moment ago, is that I've been politically on the left all my life, and I find myself now being blamed somehow. I find that people think I must be right-wing because the only people who agree with me about this tend to be politically on the right. That's not really true, but they often think it is. I mean, do you find that?
I mean, there's a very significant movement here in the UK on the left of the women who came up through the unions and who, are very good organisers, who are sex realists. And so I think here in the UK, it's really easy to say, oh, look at Woman's Place UK. I mean, J.K. Rowling, look at her. She's not exactly right-wing. So, it is often said, but it's an American thing to say. It's because of the American polarization, and it's part of the Americanization.
That's right. I should have said that. That's American.
Oh, but it gets said to us too. I mean, I
Yes.
get told that I'm funded by the Heritage Foundation, that I'm
Yes.
getting money from shadowy right-wing American groups. I'm not. It's a joke among the women that I work with. People are always saying, "Have you got any of your far-right money yet? Like, it must be stuck in the post." No, we haven't. We don't get funding from them. It is very irritating, and I suppose I find it less irritating because I never thought of myself as either left or right wing. Mm-hmm. I wasn't even a left wing student politician. I've always been a very include me out person. Like I've voted for every party, every one of the three main parties here. Honestly, don't know who I could vote for now. But you will find that in this movement, the people who are willing to speak on this issue are often people who have been through some crucible beforehand. And those can be good, bad, or indifferent things as far as I'm concerned. Lots of Brexiteers, lots of anti-vaxxers, lots of evangelical Christians, people who have had some formative experience, like, I think, probably you sticking with atheist rationalism while the new atheist movement degenerated into gender woo. You've already been cast out in some way. And if you've already been cast out, well, you've got used to it. You know what it's like, and you know that you can survive it. And so I do see a lot of very varied people who have already experienced being cast out.
Right. Well, we'd probably better come to a close. Would you like to tell us a bit about your organisation, Sex Matters, as we close?
Sure. So anyone who's read my book will have met Maya Forstater, who is the person I shaped the chapter about Britain, otherwise known as Turf Island, around TERF being trans-exclusionary radical feminist, and it's what we get called for believing that sex is real.
Yes, do tell Maya's story. We
Yes.
ought to hear that.
So Maya she was a specialist in international tax flows and development, and she worked for a think tank called the Centre for Global Development, which is based in Washington, and they had an arm based in London. And at the time, in 2017, the government was thinking of changing the law to allow for gender self-ID, meaning that you would be able to get a new birth certificate stating whichever sex you liked just by asking. Obviously insane when you put it like that, but anyway, they were about to do it, and Maya thought, but in development, sex is actually a really important variable. So, maybe we should talk about this. Maybe we should talk about how gender self-ID destroys the basis on which we do a lot of the work that we do. And that was fine initially with her colleagues in London, but colleagues in America, because all of this gender stuff comes from America.
Yeah, like everything else.
Yeah, we live in America now, all of us. They complained and said she was transphobic, and to cut a long story short, she lost her job. So she went to the Employment Tribunal and she lost end of 2019, that must have been, end of 2020, as the book was, as I was writing the book. And in the Employment Tribunal, the judge, James Taylor, said that her belief that there are two sexes, the sexes are immutable, and sometimes recognising that is important for women's rights. That's her belief. That was not worthy of respect in a democratic society. And so she deserved to lose her job. And I mean, the way that the law is written, it's not just deserved to lose her job. It would mean that anyone could discriminate against her at will. They could turn her away from a bar. They could refuse to ever employ her anywhere, provide her with any services, because this is the law that protects us against discrimination in employment and provision of goods and services. What he was saying was that she was a Nazi. She was literally equivalent to being a Nazi, or somebody who says, we want to bring back slavery. So I knew Maya by this point, and she's a very brave woman, and very, very dogged. So she had to go to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, in which the original ruling was overturned in its entirety. I mean, the judge just didn't know what he was talking about, and that set precedent. So now the belief that sex is binary, immutable, and that matters is a protected belief in UK employment and provision of goods and services. As a result of her precedent. Yes, that precedent is set. So now in a workplace, if you say, I think we need to have men's and women's toilets because there are two sexes and women need them, they can't say, you bigot.
Okay. I've just found in your book the questions that the lawyer on behalf of the company that got rid of her asked. On what basis did she think male people couldn't become female? Could she name philosophers who agreed with her? I couldn't. Why philosophers? What have they got to do with this? Biologists, you want to ask. How could she know someone's sex if she hadn't been present at their birth? doctors assign sex by looking at newborns and using guesswork.
So she had to answer all of those things under oath. And the reason it's a philosophy is because the protected characteristic in the Equality Act is religion or belief. And she was claiming a belief. You can't just protect facts.
Yeah. It does say at which the room packed with women supported erupted in laughter. I'm not surprised it erupted in laughter.
Yes, and then after all of that, Judge Taylor said that, her belief was a novel belief that was not protected because it was too harmful to other people's rights. So anyway, Maya set up with some lawyers, including her barrister, Anya Palmer, this organisation, Sex Matters, and I left The Economist to go and work for it because, honestly, I feel in some ways that this is, a generation-defining battle. Actually, because it's a battle against reality, as you said, also against free speech, against women's rights, against gay people's rights, and it's a battle to keep children from being indoctrinated because children are being lied to. All of them. They're being lied to about their bodies, about human nature, about sexuality, and they're being misled, all of them, and for some of them that's leading them to a path to sterility.
That's what bothers me most, I must say.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. Once again, Helen's book is Trans When Ideology Meets Reality. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for having me on.